IVM.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of the Musafir Stories, India's very own travel podcast, where each week we share the journey of travelers in their own words and relive their experiences with you, our listeners.
Hey guys, welcome to a brand new episode of the Musafir Stories. Hope you're all well and keeping safe. On the podcast today, we have Udbhav Agarwal, author of the book A for Prayagraj, a short biography of Allahabad. We talked to Udbhav about his love for Allahabad, a brief history of the place, as well as some interesting snippets from his book. As a part of the episode, we're giving away 2 copies of Udbhav's book. All you have to do is listen to the episode and answer 3 simple questions linked in the description of the episode. Good luck, and let's get on with the episode now. So with that introduction, we'd love to welcome Udbhav Agarwal, author and a PhD candidate to the Musafir Stories. Udbhav, thank you so much for being a part of the podcast and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Udbhav, thank you so much for being a part of the podcast. And I introduced you as author and a PhD candidate. And if people are wondering why we have Udbhav on the podcast, that is because Udbhav's debut book is about a wonderful city. And that's what we'll be discussing about today. But before that, Udbhav, the introduction I gave about you was pretty short and concise. So why don't you speak a little bit more about yourself, and then we can hop on and talk a little bit more about your book as well.
Sure. As Seth already said, my name's Udbhav. I was born in Allahabad, India, and I stayed in the city till when I was 13, and then I went to boarding school in India for a few years, and then I came to the US for my undergrad, and I've been here for about, 8 years now. And over the years, as I've kind of moved in and out of Allahabad, returned to the city or moved away from it, I've always tried to figure out what my connection to the city was. The culmination of all those journeys is what led to this book that we're talking about.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Udbhav. And yeah, really eagerly looking forward to this as well, especially when it is these iconic cities, right? It's always very hard to cover them off in a podcast episode, right? You can't really do justice to all of them. And even in the book, I'm sure you might have found that challenge
Yes.
as well, that it's always so hard. But again, we look at it from your perspective, your experience, and what you felt all of these years living there, and your journeys back to Allahabad, even while you've been away from it as well. Can you give a brief synopsis about the book as well? I know you mentioned that it's about your journeys, but at a high level, like what was the thought process, or when did you come up with this idea that, hey, I think I have to jot down my thoughts and make this into a book?
I think because as anyone who kind of, is born somewhere and lives there and actually ends up leaving that place, I think there's a very strange kind of relationship that you form with the places that you leave behind. And for me, when I, went to boarding school first, but then more so when I came to America, I was not sure what my relationship to Allahabad was. And I didn't simply want to, leave it at some kind of nostalgia or some kind of, NRI syndrome of just like appreciating or exoticizing these places. So that was, one of the first impulses where I was like, hey, there is this background, this past to me, which I don't really know how to relate to or how to make sense of. And with that, I was, kind of starting to write some stories on Allahabad, just like minor anecdotes that I picked up here and there in conversations when I was in America. So that was happening on one side. And then I was also studying sociology and political science. And so when time came for me to, write a thesis for my undergraduate senior year in my undergrad, I found myself returning to Allahabad from a more sociological lens. And that was the time when a lot of the political landscape in India was changing. Far right was coming up. There was a lot of re-scripting of Allahabad. The narrative around Allahabad was changing. Eventually, the name of the city would change. Actually, I found an in back into Allahabad, into this past that I had kind of left behind through these seismic changes in its fabric and in its culture. And as I, went back to research for my thesis, interviewing people, that kind of sparked off a very. It turned out that I was unlocking parts of me in that journey, which I wasn't aware of, just reconciling things that I never really considered. That the political and the personal kind of started merging together. Eventually, I, ended up writing a proposal for a book to Aleph, who has this beautiful city series, and it got accepted, and I got a chance to explore that more fully and more comprehensively. These lines, yeah.
Okay, yeah, wonderful. And yeah, definitely does makes a lot of sense as well, especially when you're living in a place you don't tend to think as much about it. Like that's what I've always felt about Bangalore as well. When you're there, you don't, and not just
Yeah.
places, I guess, with a lot of things, right? Even with people, when you're with them, you don't tend to appreciate them as much. But when you tend to like be away from them or get away from them, that's when like you start like reminiscing a lot of those things and like trying to think more deeply about what that place or that person meant to you, right? So really looking forward to this conversation as well. And before we get too deep into the conversation, assuming some of us living under a rock don't know where Allahabad is, Udbhav, would you please educate us a little bit about the place itself, where Allahabad is situated?
So Allahabad is usually associated with Eastern UP. You can, sense it in the language that's spoken there. It's very different from Western UP, and the Leheza and all of that. But the big thing about Allahabad that, a lot of people know it for is that it's situated in the intersection of two rivers. So Ganga and Yamuna, they meet at Allahabad and they kind of form a cradle for the city. Historically, that has also been, the region has been very fertile. It's one of the things which I begin the book by saying that people would come here would always set in its geography, because it's always fertile. You kind of always expected people will come here. Yeah, and I mean, it's now we've just had a new airport come into the city. So it's become very connected, which is surprising for, such an important city.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Very accessible and very well connected. So getting there should not be a problem either via roadways, railways, or like Udbhav said, now the airport. Again, just going back to your point about this being a very historic and iconic city, right? Even over time, and it's also been known as one of the longest living cities as well. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about the history of the place as well? And you kind of touched upon the recent name change in 2018 to from Allahabad to Prayagraj, but this is not the first time, right? There has been name changes in the past as well. So, do you want to give us a little bit background about the history of Allahabad or Prayag, as it was known?
So Allahabad is one of the oldest living cities in the world, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. It's often kind of paired with Banaras, Varanasi in the same, associated with the same kind of past. The first mentions of inhabitants in Allahabad dates back to I think 1000 BCE in the Rig Veda. What is important about that time is that the city as we know it right now didn't really exist then. It was just a kind of small strip of kutiyas and just riverbed settlements with a lot of munis, and there was a lot of religious activity there.
Right.
So that was like the oldest avatar of Allahabad, and it is then from there we get the name Prayag, which is actually referring to Yag, the ritual,
Right.
and it was believed that Lord Brahma had performed these yagyas here, thus yagya. So that's where the name Prayag comes from. And then over the years, as you have this, different dynasties coming to the area, no one actually settles in Allahabad, in the region
Right.
of where the two rivers are meeting. There's a lot of people are settling, like the Guptas and all, set nearby, and they make trips to Allahabad, this area specifically, but they do not start living here. It's only with the Mughals and specifically with Akbar
Right.
that a kind of city as we know it today starts forming, and Akbar gives it the name of Allahabad, which is a very interesting name, because a lot of times people confuse it because when the British came, they started calling Allaha, not Ilaha. So they sort of connoted with Allah in some reason, but Ilaha actually has a more broader meaning, which is just a reference to the supreme power. So Allahabad is where the supreme power lives. So that's what Akbar called it, the city, and there was a lot of Mughal and Sufi architecture that came up during that time. And he really took it upon himself to kind of develop Allahabad as we know it. And then, of course, Allahabad becomes a big, big, big node in the British colonial administration.
Right.
It becomes the capital of the north provinces. This is the kind of cerebellum of where the British, in somehow, rule a big part of the colonial India.
Right.
And so when they are coming in, there's a lot of restructuring of the city and a remapping of the city. So what was initially very smallish but very full of character boroughs or neighborhoods and villages even, some of them are actually burnt down by the British and built over. And then you have this design, which is, of course, repeated in a lot of cities in the colonies, where you have this area called the White Town,
Right.
and then the other areas. So now when you come to Allahabad, you see a little bit of the Mughal architecture in spurts, but the big kind of the way the city is mapped is the British way. So there is all the colonial administrations, the huge colonial bungalows, the company garden, which is kind of the centerpiece of the city in some ways, and then right outside the company gardens and the railway tracks on one side, you have those other previous ways of organizing city spaces. So very tight, very congested, small serpentine streets in different neighborhoods. So yeah, it has seen a lot. The city has seen a lot. And after the British, of course, it also becomes a big seat of rebellion against the British. So the Gandhis are here, the Nehrus are here. It's a hotbed of political activity. And after independence, of course, it's a story of steady and a slow decline from all of that. To this kind of a very anonymous looking town. Like now, if you come to Allahabad, it with the malls and with the shopping complexes, and you kind of see that personality of the city, even its architecture and its space is dwindling and disappearing. So that's like a short and sweet past of the city. Yeah.
One of the key, I guess, features or the characteristics of the city also has been this intersection of the two rivers, right? Ganga, Yamuna, and the invisible Saraswati and the Sangam, as they say, right? Triveni Sangam, as they call it. That has been one of the key features. And obviously, during the later times, with Mughals or Akbar actually setting up camp here, and also Jahangir was one of them, stayed here for a little bit. So all of that influence resulted in the confluence not just of the two rivers, but also the different kinds of people coming from different areas, right? So it's given rise to this very unique concept called as this Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, right? Would you, you've touched upon that in the book as well, but would you like to kind of enlighten us a little bit more about this concept as well, Udbhav?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that was one of the most fascinating things about Allahabad's fabric of the city. But basically, that the Tehzeeb was really just a way of people belonging to different religious identities kind of being thrust together in the same spaces, and then finding a way to live with each other. And what was astonishing is that there was a way in which they could be of their religion, but also be of the other religion in a very interesting way. So there were there'd be like small etiquettes or practices that would make the relationship between these two groups of people very convivial and syncretic in some ways. So, I mean, in the book, I'm following the story of this person, Akshat Lal Allahabadi, who has these stories of how the Chowk area of Allahabad, which is one of the oldest areas of the city, which came up a lot in the during the Mughal time, how Hindus and Muslims kind of lived there, and how like rituals, for instance, like the tazia that's lifted is funded by a Hindu family, how Akshat's grandfather was given a Muslim name and was referred to by that name for the longest time in his life. So these small, small things that signal a kind of coming together of these two cultures almost.
Right.
And kind of getting filigreed onto each other. And that came to be known as Tehzeeb. And of course, the metaphor of the rivers coming together was very important to kind of describe these two cultures meeting. And even now you can sense it in the language. Hindi and Urdu are just mixing together in the food. So it's kind of inseparable almost.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, especially the stories like you mentioned, right? The Chowk ki
Mhm.
Holi to the Muharram procession being flagged off
Yeah.
by the Hindu family in the area. Like all of those really heartening stories, and it's great to actually hear from you. And obviously, you in turn speaking with the locals and the people who've been living and experiencing this over several decades, right? So that's really heartening and gives a sense of this Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, which is very unique, I would say. I know perhaps this occurs across a lot of other places in India as well, where people of different religions are living together. But in Allahabad, right, this blooms and really shows up beautifully too. So I'm glad that
Mhm.
was captured beautifully in the book. And I really love, I have to call this out even before we get too deep into the conversations, that I love the wordplay and the way you've named all the different chapters in the book.
Oh.
For somebody who's just looking at it, might not make a lot of sense, but once you start reading it and how the chapter names are connected to stories within the book, it's great. And this first one, by the way, is Mekalu Tiki, which kind of shows the confluence of cultures and also times in to some extent, right? So we'll continue to make these wonderful references as we go through the conversation. Now, just touching upon, we touched upon the Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, but one of the other important and really unique, again, unique in a way that it is one of the largest gathering of people for a religious ceremony of sorts, right? The Kumbh Mela, that also is very, very iconic and special to to the place, to the city. And do you want to touch a little bit more upon that as well? Because I mean, very unique in the sense one happens once every 12 years, and it also has a unique backstory as to how the name came about as well. Do you want to touch upon that, Udbhav?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Kumbh Mela is actually, as we know it right now, it's not too old. It's only been happening for a few hundred years. And there's an essay in Arvind Krishna Mehrotra's book, The Last Bungalow, which kind of excavates this past of the Kumbh Mela. But the name really comes from this myth of the churning of the ocean, where the demons and the lords were churning the ocean, and the pot that they were, but it was in the middle of the churning, kind of fell, and it's believed to have spilled Amrit in Allahabad. So that's where the name Kumbh is the name for the pot,
Right.
comes from. And now, I mean, Kumbh Mela in the recent years, especially this last iteration, there were about 150 million people who attended.
Yeah.
And literally, in the winter time, when the kind of river water, the river really kind of is not as voluminous, an entire city is built on the riverbeds. Like sanitation, camps, electricity, everything, food, everything it's a very self-sufficient city. And of course, you have all these pilgrims coming in. And it was at the same time becoming extremely commercialized. So it almost felt like it was an amusement park of sorts, where you have these like advertisements for like Pepsi and other brands, and then you have all these attractions from the religious past of the city. So like you go to this tent and watch this sadhu perform this trick or that trick or something like that. So these two things happening simultaneously was I felt was a kind of lessening of the religiosity and replacing it with a kind of commercialized branding of what this was meant to be. But yeah, that's what Scum was about.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I think, to get a perspective. Obviously, somebody who's visiting it for the first time might not be able to make this relative comparison, but it's interesting to hear this from you as well over time, right, over your previous visits, how this is kind of slowly metamorphosized, and I guess in a way also keeping up with times, I guess, right?
Yeah.
In general, like a lot of these things are also things we do see across, right? Commercialization to other things we see playing out, be it the politics or whatever it is. It's interesting to see that it shows in pretty much every aspect of life, including the Kumbh.
Yeah.
The other important thing that also like first comes to mind, like obviously important personalities of Allahabad too, right? Like you mentioned, it's always been like at the fore and at the center of a lot of activity, be it from the times from Akbar or later on during the independence struggle as well. So a lot of key movements have been involved in this area too, right from Gandhiji starting his marches to even people like Chandrasekhar Azad, right? Right here in the city. Some of those have been touched upon in the book too. Do you want to call out perhaps some of the examples that's touched upon in the book, Udbhav? Because this is very, very key, just not just in terms of the place, but even some of the personalities that have come out of the place, right?
As I was saying earlier, that Allahabad has, been was not only an important node of British administration, but also an important center of the reaction to that and kind of the march towards independence. Right after independence, for like maybe 30 years, because it was such an important place from where the country was being governed, a lot of people came here and settled here. And there was a really kind of vibrant political cultural life of the city. So there was, from the politics point of view, there was so much, of course, Nehru and Gandhi were here, and the Nehru house is still there, Anand Bhavan, which is beautifully preserved even now. But apart from that, there were a lot of big writers like Firaq Gorakhpuri, like Upendranath Ashk, who were also based here, like Mahadevi Verma. And of course, the freedom fighters, more like militant ones. Chandrasekhar Azad was here. He was actually shot in the Company Garden in Allahabad, and his pistols kept in the museum in Company Garden as well. And even the tree where he shot, it's marked and it's monumentalized to him. So yeah, there are a lot of. I mean, that was one of the most difficult parts about the book. Actually, was to find a way to navigate these rich cast of characters. And it's just a never-ending cast of characters almost.
Yeah, definitely. Very, very important places. And even I believe when the actual handing over of the reins from the British East India Company to the government, right? The British government happened. That also happened here, right? At the Minto Park, I understand. So a lot of key events, places and people all coming out of this area, and also just touching upon the literary history of the place too and the personalities involved. Your chapter 3, I guess, right? The chapter on is this Baketi? Yeah, I think Baketi is the one that touches upon a lot of the literary history of the place. A lot of important names. You did mention in passing a couple of them, but the important one is about this, can I say, immigrant author whose biography you're going almost on a treasure hunt of, right? Can you give us a quick peek into that chapter and that story and your experience going around trying to find this copy as well?
So, as I was saying, Allahabad has been home to a lot of great literary personalities. But the one person that I was very drawn to was this writer who immigrated to Allahabad. His name's Upendranath Ashk. He came here from Punjab, and he was not really accepted in the community of writers here. He was also to be blamed for it. I mean, he was volatile, very expressively angry at people and not discouraging, but criticizing people's writing. So part of it was him, part of it was this kind of Hindi literary establishment not accepting a writer from Punjab who's writing in a Punjabi inflected Hindi. But he really left a lot of books behind. A big oeuvre of writing. And what was fascinating to me was that he has this series of books about this writer, Chetan, his fictional character, 5-volume series. It's called Girti Diwareon, Foreign Walls. And in that, there is the second book in that series is called Sheher Mein Ghoomta Aina, In the City Amid of Wandering, which is this massive 500, 600 page book. Set in a single day of this writer's life. So that was something that I was very fascinated by, is like how much detail and minutiae he can, as a writer, he's able to kind of excavate that writer book of 500 pages set in a single day. So that really struck me. And then I wanted to read more about him. And I found out in one of my interviews that he has also left a 5-volume autobiography called Chehre Anek, or Faces Aplenty. So I decided that I'll go find this autobiography and read more about him. I found out that not a lot of the bookstores in the city either knew about the book, and none of them actually had it. So I went to bookstores, I went to libraries, I went to old presses. In doing that, what I also found was the state of this literary landscape of the city was actually very discouraging. The bookstores, their stocks weren't updated for years. The books were just, gathering dust. There was barely anyone to actually buy a book. A lot of people were there to just, prepare for some competitive exams or something, finding those books. And what was also striking was that this new generation of people who were occupying these spaces were actually not in Allahabad to stay in Allahabad. They were coming into the city for their education or for a job or something, and they'd almost always leave the city to go seek better opportunities, which was striking from someone like Ashk, who had just migrated and spent a lot of his life here. Ultimately, I kind of found his grandson's number. I called him, and then he was going to return my call. And after a long time, I finally found the autobiography. But sort of that journey of like going around in that day, trying to find his autobiography and commenting on the state of these libraries and presses and booksellers used to be so lively at one point, just kind of disappearing. That was very interesting to me.
Yeah, definitely. It does give, like you mentioned, a sense of the literary landscape, and one that has been, I guess, a sort of a theme, right? Has been very, very rich in the past, but slowly you're saying the current day scenario is something very different, and people just focused on competitive exams and things like that, and not really on the rich literary history and the personalities that have been coming out of the place, right? Right from the important names like you mentioned now to even Mahadevi Verma and even Amitabh Bachchan's father, right?
Yeah.
Ravansh Rai Bachchan. All of those important names coming from this very city, and just kind of moving a little bit further into the book as well. You do, in a lot of these other chapters that are there, through your conversations, throw some light on the current state of affairs as well, right? Apna Time Aayega, for example, is another chapter where you shed some light on education and employment, or the lack of it, perhaps. Couple of very interesting chapters that I found in the book also that I'd like to touch upon, Udbhav, is one, Samdam Gun Bhed, right? A takeoff on Samdam Dan Bhed, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that one was a very interesting one, and also, I guess, gives a sense of the bureaucracy and corruption to some sense, right? So that's one. And the other one was Firse Fyar or Firse Firaq. That was also very interesting. And yeah, I didn't quite get the Firaq reference until I realized that there is the connection to the poet as well, and obviously view of the queer scene or the queer community in Allahabad, how that is. So very interesting chapters too. Any quick thoughts on those?
See, Samdam Ganbhed was really like, I wanted to take this because Allahabad used to be a big, bureaucratic center. And you have all these like legends about how fair and just Allahabad's bureaucrats were. And of course, Allahabad has the High Court of UP. Even now, I mean, Allahabad's High Court is always in the news for some landmark cases and all of that. But so I wanted to get a sense of how this underbelly of Allahabad, how criminals and lawyers and businessmen, they all come together and form this like kind of network which really influences people's lives in the city. And so, for people who read the book, they'll find I've spoken to criminal lawyers who are protecting, members of parliament who are also dons. I've spoken to this villager who becomes this big silt business person who comes in to challenge the authority of, these mafia don MP figures. And what I found actually about that whole thing was that there was a way in which all of this made the city space very masculine. You had to be a certain kind of aggressive or a certain kind of macho to kind of fit in the cityscape with these characters, which I was also trying to bring out. That was Samdam Ganbhed. And as you were saying, the other chapter, F for Fyar, Firse Firaq, was really about, inspired from Firaq Gorakhpuri, who was this queer poet and professor in Allahabad University, interspersing his couplets his beautiful love couplets that he was writing to his lover, how young people find love in the city or try to find love in the city. And that took me into a very almost a very different experience of city space where because I was tracking queer love stories, one thing you find is that the very publicness of a city tries to work against you as you try to find some sense of privacy to get by your business. So it was interesting is that you'd think that it's very difficult to like find those spaces, which it is. But at the same time, as I was uncovering stories on chat rooms, on dating apps and stuff like that, I found that even the most public spaces were also sites of where desire is being expressed, where people are, expressing their love and stuff. So the planetarium, for instance, when the planetarium show begins, one couple was telling me that that's the time when they sit in the hall, and when the hall goes dark, they find a time to caress each other there. Or when they're eating chaat somewhere, they'll just take an extra second to feed each other a golgappa. And these small things, which, a kind of reclaiming of the city space for their love story, which was very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. It's very beautifully captured, and a lot of the references you've made in these two chapters as well, right? It definitely does make a really good and breezy read through. You don't really feel like you've lost track anywhere. It's all very well connected and very well presented, and a lot of these stories are also tied really well, so that keeps the reader, and in this case the listener, engaged. A couple of quick things I'd also like to call out as we kind of start to wrap up with some of the other important spots within the city as well. We can't always forget about food. Yeah, wherever you go, whatever it is, especially we Indians, we cannot forget about food. So do you want to call out some of the important and in a few cases even iconic eateries and spots that are popular in Allahabad?
No, definitely. I mean, Allahabad has a big fooding culture, and people love to eat in Allahabad. A few places that just the top of my head, you definitely, if you're visiting Allahabad, should make a visit to Coffee House. It's one of those places where the flavor of the sambar, or of course it's like serving all these English breakfast staples along with South Indian food. So it was always interesting, but the flavor really hasn't changed in years. I mean, I've been going there since I was maybe 3 or 4, and I think the flavor still stays the same. So Coffee House is a great place to visit. Then when you go to Chowk, Allahabad, there are at least two places. There's this place called Hari, and there's this place called Sulaki Sweets, and they're famous. Hari is famous for its samosas and kachoris.
Sure.
And even now, I mean, random people I meet, even in Baltimore where I am, and they get to know that I'm from Allahabad, and they're like, "Oh, can you bring me a Hari ka samosa next time you come here?" So the huge places, Hari and Sulaki, and of course I have to mention this bakery called El Chico, which is really old. Was the first bakery of its kind in this area. So a lot of people from Banaras, Kanpur, Lucknow still crave the El Chico muffins. It is a big landmark in people's minds when it comes to Allahabad's food scene. And of course, if you get to try chaat somewhere in Allahabad, you should give yourself the pleasure of having chaat in Allahabad.
Yeah, definitely. The Cow Gully is popularly known as. Make sure if you're visiting Allahabad, you try out some of those. And how can we forget without a mention of the Allahabadi pan as well, right?
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's something that you've not forgotten to call out in the book too. So thank you for that. Allahabadi pan is also very popular, as is the Amrud, right? Its fruits
Yeah.
are also very popular, and Amrud actually stands out, and a lot of it that's exported from India is from Allahabad, and kind of goes back and ties back to that culture of, I guess, from the time of the Mughals, right? Having these baghs, and especially the Khusro Bagh and the places around, and all of that. All in all, lovely journey, and just takes you. It's also literally trip down not just memory lane, but it was also, I'd say, almost like time travel, right? You're starting off back from the ages, just making the connections to how the city's name came about, how it's been inhabited for the longest time, from those times to the more recent times of Tinder and Grindr and everything, right? It's actually a good just trip down not just the memory lane, but also a little bit of a time travel. And the great part for me was I usually I don't often read books that are very thick and voluminous, and this is such a breezy read that I could finish it off in a couple of sittings. I think that was a great part too. So thank you so much, Udbhav, and thank you for coming and sharing that with our listeners as well. And like we were discussing at the beginning, we'll also figure a way out to give a few copies of the book to some of our listeners too. So we'll definitely figure that out. But for somebody who's looking to keep in touch, and is there more books coming down the line, or what is the plan now? I know you said you're pursuing a PhD now, but how does it look like from here?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to write another book. I don't know when I will be able to write one, but I have been thinking about writing a bigger book on UP in this similar vein. So let's see when that comes about. But I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed the book, and thank you so much for having me here.
Well, absolutely. The pleasure was all ours, and we look forward to your upcoming book whenever that happens. We'll keep an eye out for that as well, Udbhav. And thank you so much again for coming and sharing all these lovely stories on the Musafir Stories.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir.
That was yet another great episode on the Musafir Stories. Make sure to show us some love by sharing the podcast with your friends and family. We are on Instagram and Twitter at Musafir Stories. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM podcast app or the website. Follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram.